Okay, now we come to the actual winners, and I think by process of elimination you may have guessed who they might be. Now here's Peter to give the introduction.
I am delighted to announce that the joint winners of this year's Secularist of the Year prize are Phil Johnson and Reverend Graham Sawyer. This award goes to them in recognition of their tireless campaigning over many years to expose the institutional abuse of children and vulnerable adults in the Church of England. And they persevered despite incredible official hostility and obstruction. They stuck at it when everything possible was placed in their path to stop them exposing what was going on and to get redress for the victims. So Phil and Graham are two exceptionally courageous, tenacious, and very determined men who simply refused to give in to the lies, deceit, and cover-ups by the church hierarchy. In the last few weeks of hearings at the child sex abuse inquiry, no name has had more mentions than Phil Johnson. And what's become clear in these hearings is that the church is absolutely terrified of him. They're of course not terrified because he's a nasty or intimidating person. It's just that he has a tremendous commitment to expose the truth. And that's what the church has feared and still fears all this time. I think Phil joked the other day that if he had a £5 note for every time he got a mention in the internal Lambeth Palace memos, he'd be a very rich man. Certainly if Phil had not fought and campaigned and battled so hard for so many years, in all likelihood we never would have had this current inquiry. Graham too is a man of immense courage who refused to cower, refused to hide away, refused to shut up when he was confronted by bullying threats which came right from the top of the church itself. They wanted to silence him. And as a man of the church, it took real exemplary courage to take that personal stand against the church leadership. Like Phil, Graham's forceful, articulate advocacy for survivors has inspired many others. Between them, those two men have inspired others to take up the cudgel and to run with the equal aim of exposing this abuse. They've given courage and inspiration to survivors to speak out. What's different about Graham is, of course, that he is a reverend. He is both deeply religious and a deeply spiritual man. But he's also a true secularist. He is the meaning of secularism personified. He's showing that you can be religious and have a deeply held religious faith, but also challenge religious power and privilege and believe that the church has a moral responsibility to play by the same rules as everyone else and to stand up for the victims of abuse. Both men have been really inspiring figures which have encouraged so many others to step forward. By their bravery in the face of denial, cover-up and intimidation, they have helped expose the appalling abuse that's gone on. They've helped ensure that there are changes happening, and more changes will happen, that will in all likelihood ensure that children and vulnerable adults will be protected in the future. So I am so honoured to announce Phil and Graham as the very worthy winners of Secularist of the Year 2018.
Thank you, Peter, for those enormously generous comments. Forgive me reading from a text, but as you won't be surprised to hear, I'm not the most popular man with my current bishop, so I need to be able to cover my back a bit. Now, there are a number of people, obviously, to thank for this enormously generous award. First, the National Secular Society for making such a bold and brave statement, perhaps even of faith, in jointly awarding me this honour. It does, however, show that this is truly a society that believes both in freedom of religion and freedom from religion. I hope that in the coming year that I shall not provide disappointment to the generosity of those who have chosen me. Second, I want to thank Phil. During the time that both Stonewall and Outrage were trying to effect change in the law to ensure equality of treatment and equality of opportunity for all people regardless of sexual orientation or gender, they developed a mutual respect between the two organisations that softly lobbying alongside direct action was a potent combination in achieving a common ideal. Similarly, Phil, for many years, has done something that I could never do. He has sat through countless meetings with church officials trying to influence a change that will bring about better treatment of survivors of clergy-perpetrated sexual abuse. Now, working with bishops and other church officials, as I do as a priest in the Church of England, I believe that the way to effect change is from within, although this isn't easy. Now, Phil has worked tirelessly over so many years to bring change from within, but a different way from me and in an extremely effective way. Now, given that I've been told that it wasn't recent, it was about 3 years ago, I was told that the bishops refer to me as the most turbulent priest in the Church of England. What Phil continues to do provides very necessary communication and lobbying, which ultimately I think will, I believe, effect change. I hope that I have added to this in coming out publicly as someone, indeed a serving priest, who was abused by a bishop, along with making public statements that are critical of the way the church has treated survivors and victims. I hope that my slightly different way will, as with Stonewall Outrage all those years ago, help effect some change for all. Now, the third person I want to thank is actually Peter Tatchell. Although we seem of a very similar age, only 9 years between us, what he doesn't know is that as a teenage boy about to go to university, and I'm afraid realising, Peter, that I wasn't exactly straight, and with pronouncements at that time from the then Archbishop of Canterbury describing gay people as, and I quote, handicapped, Peter's direct action was hugely inspirational to me as a schoolboy. We all remember, of course, his attempt at a citizen's arrest on Robert Mugabe and applaud him for that. But for me, it was the storming of the pulpit where George Carey was preaching on Easter Day in Canterbury Cathedral that inspired me most. Today is actually the third time I've been in the same room as Peter. The last was the summer of last year at Hebden Bridge Pride, when he spoke about the people who have influenced him over the years and inspired him to direct action. I was astounded that the people he mentioned were pretty much the very same people that had inspired me. The time before, the first time I met him was in Sydney in Australia, about 20 years ago. He gave a very powerful speech, although it was evident that this was perhaps one of the more difficult times for him in his life. And at that speech in Sydney, he was asked what were the main components for success in campaigning for change. And I've never forgotten them. And this is what Peter said. First, you must be without fear. Well, I made the choice some time ago not to be afraid of the bishops, and indeed the lay hierarchy as well in Church House here in London, who've sought to discredit, destroy and isolate me and many other people over so many years. Indeed, perhaps rather like Peter being physically assaulted by Robert Mugabe's henchmen, I've learned that our greatest successes can be made when we show our scars publicly. Second, Peter said that it was important always to tell the truth. Integrity in truthfulness is essential, as I'm afraid our opponents, and Phil I'm sure will back me up on this, will lie again and again and again. By maintaining integrity of truthfulness ourselves and in our lives and in our speech, we will win every time. And third, Peter also said that it was important not to take taunts and attacks personally. Well, this is perhaps the most difficult of the 5 marks of success that Peter mentioned all those years ago. Clearly, the attacks by opponents are meant personally. But if we take them as such, they're going to wound us even more. Fourth, Peter told us never to give up. When we look back at the long struggle for the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, which came into force in 1871, it was after many, many years of campaigning by people such as Parnell and many others. They were imprisoned, physically attacked, and they were vilified for decades. Think too of William Wilberforce and others striving for decades for the abolition of slavery. They never gave up, and nor should this society. Finally, Peter said it was essential to employ humour whenever we can into the debate. Well, I have to say, I think that this is actually one of Peter Tatchell's greatest attributes.
Attributes failing.
The ability to make protest fun while rendering one's opponents ridiculous is rare. And Peter's direct action embarrassing pompous establishment figures and others has given me, and I'm sure all of you in this room today, great inspiration. Peter, in the best sense, is a very funny man. Phil is a very funny man, and his the conversations I've had with him on the phone at times have left me feeling much uplifted. Humour is very important. Now, the great 18th century English philosopher Erasmus Darwin, who was also a slave trade abolitionist, once wrote this: "He who allows oppression shares the crime." With regard to the bishops and archbishops who have allowed the brutal sexual abuse of children and vulnerable adults over so many decades, they continue to share in the crime, and this must be exposed. That they do so in the name of Jesus' church is the ultimate perversion, and they must face the full force of the law for their crimes. The National Secular Society that believes in freedom of religion, freedom from religion, has never been more important. The work of the Society in lobbying members of Parliament for a Britain where everyone is, as far as possible, treated equally is so very important. This is especially important in matters of religion. What sort of example are we setting to our young people when we allow one group in one religion a privileged place in our legislature by placing Church of England bishops in the House of Lords? The only other country to reserve a place in their national legislature for such a group in religion is Iran. The UK and Iran stand together in saying to people that not only are people of one particular faith privileged, but one group specifically in that one religion. What does this say to a young Muslim, a young Jew, Buddhist, or indeed someone who has no faith whatsoever? It tells them that they're not treated equally, and this is plainly wrong. Now, my impression of the National Secular Society and the members I've met over the last few years is that secularists are actually really rather kind people, because they wish to promote the values and decency of equality for all. And I see huge generosity as well in this wonderful award to me, which I share here today with Phil. And the first person I shall show is my bishop when I get back. But thank you all for this generosity, and please never give up building bridges with people of faith and those of no faith by promoting a fair society in this country and abroad that truly believes in freedom of religion, freedom from religion. I'll take it.
That will work in a minute. Right, it's a bit of a hard act to follow. Keith said to me when he asked if I'd accept the nomination for this award, I had no idea that it came with a prize. And I was just honoured to be a nominee. I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things that Graham said. Firstly, thank you for the acknowledgement. And, you know, he might think it was very noble of me to be able to sit in those rooms and, you know, endure the waffle of all those bishops for all these years. But the reality is that I actually found it was a lot warmer and a lot more comfortable sitting inside the room having the argument than standing outside and throwing stones at the windows, which I had been doing for many years. And they have very nice sandwiches at Lambeth Palace. So, anyway, Keith also asked me if I'd prepare if I was willing to say a few words at this point. And I thought you meant just say a few words. I didn't realise there would be such eloquent speeches here. And as many of you may know, I've spent the last 3 weeks with your Vice President Richard Scorer working incredibly hard at ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Childhood Sexual Abuse, where I think we have laid bare the dysfunctionality in the Church of England and shown the privilege that they hold, the contempt that they hold people who challenge them in. And that, I think, is a significant step in the road and the way forward. Now, I'm very pleased that the general public seems to have got it, that they seem to have to understand what has happened in the church and how they have covered up and tried to protect themselves rather than address the real issues. But what matters is whether the public inquiry makes recommendations that will actually make change, and whether government will introduce legislation to do anything about it. And that is something we're a long way from at the moment. This is not from my speech, and my thing just timed out. It will come back. Oh no, it won't if I put the wrong password in. Oh yeah, it's come back. Okay, I'll just have to keep wiggling my finger. I'd just like to pick up on some things that Peter has said and a couple of other people have said. I noticed the placards which I filled out one there for faith education, Now, not many people know that in this country, currently, today, 1 million children are being educated in Church of England schools. That's 1 in 6 school children currently. Now, it's only just come in that Church of England schools will have to introduce sex education. And I don't know if any of you watched any of the live feeds of the public inquiry, but for those of us that did, there was a very telling moment when we had the National Safeguarding Advisor for the Church of England giving evidence, and counsel to the inquiry, Fiona Scolding, used the word penis when talking about sex education in church schools. It's worth watching back the video just to see his reaction and how difficult he found that to deal with. Now, this is supposedly an independently minded professional safeguarding advisor, but I don't think it's an accident that he's also an evangelical Christian and he's the advisor to the church. So, there is still a lot of work to be done, even in those C of E schools, which many people aspire to send their children to. We've talked here about religious extremism and fundamentalism, and this is something that in this country has a perception of being an Islamic problem. It is not. We have conservative evangelical Christians in this country who think that it's okay to forgive somebody for even raping children, and that once they've been forgiven, that sin has been wiped out and it's as though it doesn't exist. And so therefore, they don't have to tell the statutory authorities, they don't have to act. That person is forgiven. That is a dangerous philosophy and it must be challenged. We've also had evidence that in these contexts, on the retirement of bishops and deans of cathedrals in this country, those bishops and deans have burned the records, their personal records. They've destroyed them to give everyone a clean start. Because, these people apparently have seen the light and they deserve a fresh start. So these are just some things that have come out of the last few days. Graham has been called the most turbulent priest. Rid us of these turbulent priests comes back from the time of Thomas of Becket. Now, Thomas Becket was martyred over the state's wish to separate canon law from common law, and the church was holding too much power. That was never resolved, and it's never been changed. We still have canon law, which gives clergy in this country undue privilege. So anyway, those are just my comments on some of the things that have come up, and I'll just very quickly go through what I had prepared literally on the train coming up today, because I've been inundated for the last 3 months really preparing for the inquiry and 3 weeks actually doing it. So I'd just like to say I'm really, really honoured to accept this award, and in doing so I recognise that I'm just one of many, many people who stood up to institutions to try and achieve justice and recognition and redress for the abuses perpetrated against them. Sadly, many of those victims are very harmed and damaged by what's happened to them through these powerful institutions. And so it's very important that those of us who do have the capacity and wherewithal to stand up and fight do so on their behalf. My proportion of this award will help me to continue with the work of MACSAS. Now, MACSAS is an organisation which supports and provides advocacy for people who have been sexually abused in a religious context. And this is something that we all do. Graham has been involved with me on this as well. And I'd also like to say that Richard is a supporter. Keith, over there now, has helped us, and we help support one another. And Keith has been a great supporter of another campaign which I'm actively involved in, which is called Mandate Now. I won't explain it all right away, but you can look it up. Now, MACSAS is particularly needy of funds and support because the Charities Commission has refused to recognise us over many years, as particularly since the new legislation came in, because they regard us as more of a campaigning organisation than as a charity. So they've refused our registration as a charity or as a CIC. And they say that we must give up all campaigning and lobbying if we want charitable status. Now, although we're primarily a support organisation, and that's our ethos, we are not prepared to give up speaking at events like this for lobbying the bishops and trying to get changes in legislation. That's far too important part of what we do, and if that means we can't be a charity and it makes it difficult for us to raise money, so be it. But what we do here is very important. Yeah, sorry, I rambled and went for my thing. Those who followed the Anglican hearings over the last 3 weeks will have seen revealed that this is an elitist, sexist and homophobic... this is an elitist, sexist and homophobic, and it does not see itself as accountable to the law. It continually puts its own interests and reputation ahead of the needs of victims, and in many cases it goes rallying into support of the abusers or those covering up, and attacking and bullying those people who are making the allegations, as Graham quite rightly said. Time and again it's failed to report abuse to the statutory authorities or cooperate with police investigations, in some cases destroying evidence in order to avoid public scrutiny. I firmly believe that nobody should be advantaged or disadvantaged for any religious belief or lack of it. The membership of any religious institution should not provide anyone with any privilege. Yet, the Church of England, with all its dysfunction and prejudice, still enjoys the automatic right for bishops to sit in the legislature in the House of Lords, supposedly as their moral guardians. They enjoy exemptions from legislation such as the Equalities Act, allowing them to continue to legally discriminate against women, and a priest is not recognised in law as a position of trust. This leaves 16 and 17-year-olds particularly vulnerable, as these cases are almost impossible to prosecute as the issue of supposed consent comes into them. This has to change. There should be the introduction of a law to require a mandatory reporting of suspicions or allegations of sexual abuse to the statutory authorities, so that institutions like the C of E and other religious and secular institutions cannot go on dealing with things in-house. And those who fail to report cover-up and abuse can be held to account under the law. Fighting for justice and campaigning for change and accountability, as many of you know, is long, hard and often a lonely journey. It can be at great cost, but not only to us, but to our families and our loved ones, from whom it takes away valuable time and often appreciation. So, I would like to thank and acknowledge the families and partners of all those of us involved in campaigns like this for standing by us, for their patience and support, which often goes unnoticed. And in particular, I'd like to thank Mel, who's sitting over there, my partner of 20 years. So thank you, Mel. Thank you, everyone at the NSS, and keep up the good work. Yeah.